Interesting. There are issues arising from this, disputes arising from IEPs, lawsuits over IEPs in the United States are the fastest growing, most expensive area of educational lawsuits in the United States of America, or litigation if you prefer. I have some colleagues who work in specialized schools in the United States that are behaviorally engineered schools, and the tuition may be $50,000, $60,000 a year to attend. And you wonder who can afford to send their kids there? The vast majority of kids attending, according to people talking to me, are there under lawsuit litigation. The school districts are actually paying for the students to go to specialized programs because that's cheaper than fighting the IEP lawsuits, which is pretty shocking. Luckily, that's not the case in Canada, at least at this point. Back from 95 to 2005, there's a 500% increase in the number of IEPs. So if we're not doing great with IEPs and we're seeing more IEPs, and imagine from 2005 to 2020, the prevalence of autism has gone from approximately 1 in 150 to 1 in 66 students with autism. So we're seeing way more students with autism in schools. We'll be seeing way more IEPs, which really makes this kind of a cascading problem. We need to have good IEPs. Some parent issues arising from poor IEPs. Parents being viewed as equals or not being viewed as equals in making educational decisions. That's a challenge if a parent feels disenfranchised or not included in the IEP process. Wondering about IEP objectives being followed in the classroom. They don't understand how this is being taught or where or when or by whom. Being fully informed of their rights in terms of IEP SPED law, which is more of an American thing. And classroom practices such as ineffective discipline programs. For example, if schools have policies, if a student does X, they're suspended for, say, 2 days. If they engage in aggressive behavior, aggression towards a peer, the policy that is triggered is 2 days of suspension. However, if you have a student with autism who's aggressive towards peers and isn't learning from typical contingencies, it may actually be contraindicated. You might actually be making the problem worse. It is not an educative consequence to suspend them. That would be an ineffective discipline program, and therefore inappropriate to apply. Inappropriate placement decisions. This is less of an issue in Canada, where we have primarily mainstream classes and maybe some special ed, as opposed to the United States, where this refers to placement in special education or regular education. But this certainly applies to Canadian high schools or British Columbian high schools that I visit that tend to have two streams. There's the fully integrated stream, where you follow the high school schedule and you're in classes with or without an EA, or you're in the life skills stream, oh, there's a Freudian slip, and you are in the special education room most of the time. What's lacking is a middle ground for kids who should be partially in special education and partially included, and that needs to be a flexible mix, right? There is a placement decision issue. And then support ratios and coverage. This continues to be very stressful to parents in terms of, is my child getting the EA support that they feel they deserve or that they believe they're entitled to in the school? Are they getting enough hours? Who's covering those hours? What is the training of the people providing that? A lot of concerns arise. Here's my personal 2 cents in terms of concerns about IEPs, given a more than 20-year history working in schools and being involved in IEPs. First of all, the meetings occur too late in the year. I know a lot of schools, and there are always exceptions. I should be clear with that. I go to some schools where we meet in September. We get the IEP, we have our plan, we have our path, and we're moving on it. But that's kind of the minority. Often they occur late October, November, December. It's not unheard of that it'll be January, February before an IEP occurs. And so if this is the plan for the year and half the year is gone, that's problematic. Then they're poorly defined and they lack measurable goals. That's kind of a given. And once we do write them, as the special educators quote said, they're filed away. Right? We've had our meeting, they're filed away. I can come in a month later and ask the education assistant, all right, show me the IEP. And they look at me blankly, like, I'm supposed to have the IEP? The IEP should be guiding your practice on a daily basis, right? That's what we're here to do, is implement the IEP. But it's filed away somewhere, it's not accessible. Or it's so big and vague that they can't remember what's on the IEP. And therefore, it's not a surprise that we're not moving forward in a measurable way with the IEP. Implementation fidelity is, are you implementing the tactics correctly? There's a whole research base on implementation science and implementation fidelity. A number of years ago, I was at a conference at the University of British Columbia, and we had a researcher come up and talk about implementation fidelity. It was pretty eye-opening and pretty shocking. And some of what she shared is, if you take an evidence-based practice, it's only evidence-based if you implement it correctly. If you implement it 95% correctly, it might still be evidence-based. But she shared some data where you might have a tactic that is evidence-based if done correctly. However, if you implement it only 80% correctly, right? It's mostly correct, more than mostly correct, 80% correctly, it's going to be completely ineffective. It is no longer an evidence-based practice because evidence-based means implemented correctly. So implementation fidelity, making sure people are doing the tactics the right way, is critical. There's a lack of accountability around data, and the result of all of this is that IEPs don't live up to the hype. They don't live up to the function, why they exist, right? To be an effective roadmap for our students. They don't do what they're designed to do, and who pays for that? The student pays for that because they're not making the progress that they otherwise could be making. So this is why IEPs are so important. Now, there are some concerns with traditional IEPs, and a lot of it has to do with we just aren't doing them correctly. But there's a new trend that's here already in British Columbia, and this is competency-based IEPs. And this is tied to the new curriculum that is rolled out across the province, and tied to the new curriculum are new IEPs, and now we're adding more lingo to it. CBIEPs, competency-based IEPs. So this is the new philosophical approach to IEPs in British Columbia, tied to the new philosophical approach underlying the core competencies for all students. You can see the core competencies on that image there. Communication, thinking, and personal and social well-being. You can't argue with those things. Those are good things, but that is the new philosophical framework. And there are a number of principles underlying it. Here's a partial listing. There's a lot of good news here. It supports open forms of inquiry learning. But again, as we've cautioned already today, an overemphasis on inquiry learning may de-emphasize explicit instruction of foundational skills and structured teaching that allows inquiry-based learning to be more effective, right? So I'm a little bit concerned about this potential overemphasis in inquiry learning. Again, inquiry learning in and of itself, not a problem, but it has to be done as part of a learning continuum. Absolutely no concerns. Aboriginal perspectives and content are added into the new curriculum. That is fantastic. You'll notice I started today with the territorial acknowledgement, increasing the Indigenous content of IEPs, 2 thumbs up. There's greater emphasis and commitment to inclusion with the premise that competencies are for everyone, and therefore all students have profiles that are positive and strength-based. That sounds really good, and the intention behind it of IEPs being something that can be better included in inclusive education, that sounds good. The question will be, does it live up to the hype, right? If we haven't been doing the more traditional IEPs all that great, is this going to solve those problems? We have yet to see. Here's a quick snapshot. Now remember, I took you through traditionally the 4 categories of IEP, right? Social, communication, self-determination, and academic. You can memorize those pretty quickly. Here's a breakdown of the core competencies and sub-competencies. Boom, that one just hit you over the head, right? There's overload. Information overload, can you see that? You got to squint to zoom in on that. How does that contrast with the traditional format? Well, this looks cleaner. And if you go back into this dense matrix here, if I'm thinking about social skills, well, there's a whole domain here around personal and social. Right? There's things like building relationships and valuing diversity. So this certainly includes social. In terms of communication and language, well, there's a whole domain devoted to communication. So that's the same. When it comes to academics, so there's lots of academics built in with thinking and critical thinking. And when it comes to self-determination, there's some subdomains here. You can't really see them, like self-regulation and well-being. There's a self-determination domain. So really, this structure is embedded in this structure. It's just that there's a whole lot more information in the core competencies. Now, how much does that actually translate when you go into IEP meetings in British Columbia currently and in the near future? Are the IEPs going to look fundamentally different? I'm not entirely sure. I was worried and a bit concerned that it'll look totally different. And my experience thus far is it doesn't actually look that different. Some wording differences. Here's some of the differences that you're going to see. There is new language. Instead of referring to strengths and weaknesses, right, in the student's repertoire, we are now simply adopting new synonyms. It's strengths and stretches, right? So that's not a functional change. That is a politically correct semantic change. I like it, strengths and stretches. It communicates the same thing, doesn't change the function of the words. There is a push to using more I statements. And the audience appears to be split on this, and I can see both sides of it. Traditionally, when an IEP is written, it might use my name, for example, if I'm the student, Richard Will, Richard Will, Richard Will, or in some cases it's a student will, student will. And the problem with student will is it's very impersonal. If you put my name there, Richard Will, that's great, but it's not my goal, it's you're specifying that that's my goal. If you put the personal pronoun I there, then it's my goal, right? I will learn my ABCs. I will learn to do long division. That makes more sense in some cases. There are certainly a number of students with autism where they are in the autism spectrum that it doesn't make an appreciable difference. They don't recognize the I statements, or they don't recognize the goal. They don't have input into their IEP goals. They do need their caregivers and special educators to be making decisions in their best interest. But that's appropriate. And adding I doesn't really make a difference. But there are a lot of students, as they gain more skills and get older, who certainly could be more included in the IEP process and traditionally are not, because we tend to continue our past practices of just meeting without the student, about the student. And that's a lost opportunity, where it makes increasing sense to invite the student to come at least to some of their IEP meeting, if not all of their IEP meeting. For a lot of high school students who I meet with, I recommend that the high school student be at the whole meeting so that they understand why they have an IEP and why we're here, and that we're here to help them achieve their goals, and we help them determine genuine I statements so that we can facilitate learning that's meaningful to them. That's ideal. I statements there make abundant sense. And there's also the middle ground as you move from the first category I talked about to students in that range. I can remember very clearly being at an IEP years ago for a grade 6 student with autism. And it was before school. It was the whole IEP team and his dad and I. And dad came to the IEP meeting early before school, brought the student in grade 6. The student sat outside in the hall very patiently and cooperatively, waiting quietly by himself while we had the IEP meeting. And at some point in the meeting, we were discussing things that he could be doing around the school to participate in the school. And we're sitting there coming up with, like, he could take out the recycling and deliver this to the office. And we had one other thing. And then we kind of looked at each other and it dawned on us, he's sitting right out there and we could ask him. And so, and we'd never done that before. This was his 6th year, right? 6th year in the school system, 7th year in the school system. We'd never had him participate in an IEP. But then we called him in and we said, hey, this is what we're trying to decide. What do you think? And of our 3 ideas, he said, I totally want to take out the trash. He was totally enamored with that idea because he got to take it out to the garbage man and see it go up into the truck, and that was really reinforcing to him. So he loved that idea, and he shot down our other 2 ideas, and then he came up with an idea that none of the rest of us would have come up with. He said, I want to help with assemblies. He wanted to be part of the audiovisual crew that set up the assemblies. That was not on our radar. He identified it, right? And so that was one of the kind of a formative experience for me where I thought, that was cool, and we should be doing way more of that, right? And it's really just a matter of changing how we run meetings to have the students come in more regularly and participate. And having I statements there makes sense. So those are some of the changes coming with competency-based IEPs. They are considered strength-based, and there's some, not controversy, but lack of clarity. But what does strength-based mean? We're only teaching to the student's strengths? That doesn't make sense. If we've got particular strengths and then particular stretches, if we only teach strengths, we're just magnifying the difference between the strengths and the stretches. Really, the purpose of the IEP is to teach the things that are not strengths, right? So those stretches can become stronger. So how does that jive with strength-based? Here's a quote. Targeting specific skills for remedial instruction has been criticized for being a deficit-driven approach to education, right? So that's why there's the change in the language, because it's seen as deficit-focused. However, this ignores the fact that deficits in learning and behavior are the very reason why students receive special education, and that recognizing and specifying those deficits or weaknesses or stretches is a prerequisite to meaningful intervention. That's why we have the IEP, to identify stretches and turn them into strengths ideally. So what's the uptake of competency-based IEPs in British Columbia in 2020? Right? How on board are people with this? I see 3 categories from the educators I speak to. The first category is the dominant category. It's the majority. 100% acceptance. I know a lot of my colleagues in large school districts will tell me we are 100% on board. We've changed our templates. We've got the new language in. We are doing what we're calling competency-based IEPs, 100%. Then there's a smaller group where they remain a little skeptical. They're often in those districts who are 100% on board. Oh, there goes a fire truck. Nothing we can do about that. So the skeptics they're there. They might be in the districts where people are 100% on board, and they might actually feel uncomfortable sharing their concerns because the majority is on board, but they are skeptical. They think that, is this actually solving the problems that the old IEPs of a couple of years ago had? That has yet to be seen. And I've talked to a few people who are drawing the line in the sand and saying, no, thank you. I don't see how this is improving on the IEP process. I'm concerned that this is actually degrading the IEP process. And so it's not all roses out there that everyone thinks this is a good idea. It's a philosophical change. And the proof will be in the pudding in terms of, does it result in improved student learning, which is the point of IEPs, no matter what you call them. Right? So I'm not going to go any further down that rabbit hole. We're doing really good for time here. I'm about to catch up. So here are some quotes from a special educator. So before I share that with you, as I tend to do when I do talks for ACT, I like to have my finger on the pulse of the community. So I'll often send out emails to colleagues in the education establishment, occupying all roles, and ask them, what are you thinking? What's going on with these competency-based IEPs? And I've had a lot of good feedback that kind of informs the slide you're looking at, where you see these 3 categories of uptake. But here's a quote from one special educator. First, it seems that there's been a drift from creating individualized, child-centered goals towards selection-based goal identification. I think this shift is a result of uncertainty about how best to implement the new IEP format. It seems there's been a shift toward trying to fit the child's needs into pre-existing categories and are trying to select goals from a list that are closest to what the child needs, like a drop-down menu, rather than developing individualized and meaningful IEP goals for each child based on their observed needs. So this is a person who's demonstrating some skepticism, expressing some skepticism. And it very much jives with the 10 notions, faulty notions in special education we reviewed before lunch, right? That there are certain things that we know are good special education, including individualization, and that this potentially might be interfering with that. This person goes on to say, second, the new IEP format is very much geared toward including children in the IEP development process, as I described. While I think this is a good shift, there seems to be a lot of uncertainty about how to do this in a meaningful way, particularly for children with more limited language. As I described, students who don't appreciate or understand what the IEP is or the process or the language that goes into it. This sometimes results in a lot of I statements being ascribed to the child without their actual input. Again, I believe it's just an attempt to follow the new guidelines. Everyone is just a bit unsure about how to do it. So we are now up to date. Let me end with some big ideas, and then we will take our break, our afternoon break. So the big ideas thus far is that we want to be generating an IEP that has 4 long-term goal areas. Is kind of our default base formula for kids with autism. That's going to be either social goals, communication goals, self-determination, and academics. Under each, think of those as 4 umbrellas. Under those umbrellas, you're going to have a number of short-term objectives. And those are the things that you want to achieve for the child to learn, for the student to learn through effective instruction. What's special in special education is that instruction in a reasonable amount of time, not an entire year. And those goals need to be SMART. And everyone I've talked to who's fully on board with the new competency-based IEP is in unanimous agreement that there's nothing wrong with SMART objectives. There's no replacement for SMART objectives. They do need to be specific and measurable and timely. Then each short-term objective needs to have evidence-based practices. There's your EBP. That's what's special in special education. How and where and when are we setting up the instruction, whether that's in an analog instructional setting or in the natural setting and fully inclusive education? Where is the effective teaching taking place? And then finally, how are we measuring it?